court's proposed written portion of the instructions?
I've reviewed the verdict sheet, Your Honor, and gone through most of the written instructions.
I'll give you a chance to
Yes, sir.
comment on it further before I give it. How about you, Mr. Miles?
I'm just looking at the verdict sheet now, Your Honor. That looks fine. Those look fine now.
You ready for your argument?
Yes, right.
Bring the jury in.
There we go. Excuse mercy.
For the final arguments of the lawyers. Excuse me. At the conclusion of their arguments, I will instruct you on the law, and then you will go into the jury room to begin your deliberations. As you will recall, in this case, each defendant is charged with 4 separate counts of aiding and abetting a person under the age of 21 to possess and or consume an alcoholic beverage. So you will be called upon as to each of the respective defendants and as to each of the 4 counts against each respective defendant to determine whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty of such charge. You'll have a verdict sheet giving you those options when you go to the jury room. I'll be giving you my instructions, parts of it in writing about the law with regard to those substantive offenses. In this case, there will be 2 arguments made to you. The defendant is entitled to an opening and a closing argument, but will be waiving their and I say defendant, I should say plural. The defendants are entitled to an opening and a closing argument, but the defendants are waiving their opening argument. So the first argument will be by Mr. Waller for the state, to be followed by Mr. Miles in closing for the defendants. The final arguments of the lawyers are not evidence, but are given to assist you in evaluating the evidence. The lawyers are permitted in their final arguments to do just that, to argue to you, to characterize the evidence, and to attempt to persuade you to a particular verdict or verdicts. In making a final argument, it is improper for a lawyer to become abusive. It's improper to inject personal experiences or to express a personal belief as to the guilt or innocence of a defendant. It's improper to express a personal belief as to the truth or falsity of the evidence, or to make arguments on the basis of matters outside the record. A lawyer may, however, on the basis of the lawyer's analysis of the evidence, argue any position or conclusion with respect to a matter and issue before you. If in the course of making a final argument a lawyer attempts to restate a portion of the evidence and your recollection of the evidence differs from that of the lawyer, you are in recalling and remembering the evidence to be guided solely and exclusively by your own recollection of the evidence. Do the defendants in fact waive opening argument?
Excuse me. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, sir. The court recognizes Mr. Waller for the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I please report, Mr.
Yes.
Miles?
You may proceed.
I may have the The State of North Carolina versus Charles and Kimberly Matthews. I begin with that slide for a very important reason. Not because it's obvious that that's what we're here for or anything like that. That's what Judge Smith has told you about the case and called it State of North Carolina versus the Matthews. But I want you to understand the importance of that first line. State of North Carolina. This charge, this trial that you've heard over the last few days is not just about J.T. Taylor. Certainly his life ended in tragedy that night. Certainly those parents right there got the worst news that they could ever imagine getting. And it was a tragedy, and a great young man was lost that night. But this case is about more than that. It's not the Taylors versus the Matthews here. It's about a community, you as Wake County citizens, deciding whether or not the Matthews are responsible for giving underage kids, teenagers, alcohol that night. That's what this case is about. The importance of preventing underage kids from receiving alcohol. And you are here as representatives of this community of Wake County to decide whether or not what they did was against the law. What you've heard from that witness stand and the law Judge Smith is going to instruct you on, were they in the wrong? Were they how we got here, like we talked about in opening statements? Were their actions the cause of JT, Anna, Natalie, Thomas becoming intoxicated that night because they gave them that alcohol or allowed access to that alcohol? It's a tragic event, but you are here to say, no, we're not going to allow this in Wake County in North Carolina, this type of behavior. So while we're talking about one night in question, it's important that you hold your responsibility as to saying this law applies to these individuals, this type of situation. I'm going to talk to you about the elements of this crime in just a moment. We're going to go through, there's 4 elements that you have to consider. Before that, I want to let you know the judge is going to give you some general instructions, general cautionary instructions about different types of evidence. You're going to hear about direct and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence will be the testimony of the witnesses saying that JT was drinking or Natalie was drinking or them admitting that. And then you're going to hear about circumstantial evidence as well. That being the crash that happened, showing he was intoxicated. The wine glasses on the table. The fact that Natalie and Anna both ended up in the basement because they were so intoxicated. It's a combination of direct and circumstantial evidence. But what I want you to understand, in putting the pieces of the puzzle together to form your verdict in this case, the law makes no distinction between direct and circumstantial evidence. You can use the pieces of the puzzle to decide how we got here, who is responsible, how the actions of Mrs. Matthews when the officer came to the door, what does that tell you she knew was going on? Judge Smith is also going to give you some instructions on credibility of witnesses. We talked about that in jury selection, how you're going to be the sole judges of credibility when you go back in that deliberation room here shortly. And how you can judge how people act on that witness stand, what they saw, how they responded to questions, the totality. That's your job, to decide the credibility of witnesses. You heard from witnesses in this case that are friends of the Matthews. Thomas, Dr. Matthews, and Mrs. Matthews. Judge Smith's going to talk to you about interested witnesses. That applies to both sides. You've heard from a lot of friends of the Matthews. Some of them may or may not want to be here, and you can tell from how they answered the questions. They were forced to be here. They didn't pick to be here. But they came in and they answered the questions. You're the sole judges of credibility in this case. As I mentioned, you're going to have 4 simple elements to determine in terms of the law. Each defendant's facing 4 charges, but the elements are the same for every one. A person under the age of 21 possessed or consumed wine. The defendants knowingly aided the underage person to possess, consume the wine. The defendants knew or had reason to know that the person was under the age of 21 at the time. And the defendants were over the age of 21 at the time of this incident, June 28th of 2014. That's what you have to consider. I'm going to go through each of them briefly because that's my job. But ladies and gentlemen, what this case is going to come down to is number 2. That the defendants knowingly aided the underage person to consume or possess the wine. Person under the age of 21 possessed or consumed the wine. First question I asked each one of the witnesses that came on the stand in terms of the teenagers is what their date of birth was. 4/20/1996 for Anna, 18 years old at the time. Possessed or consumed wine. You have a photograph there that she identified, or the photographer identified as her, and she's holding a glass of wine or champagne in her hand. She admitted to you on the stand that she drank wine all night long. She possessed it, she consumed it, she was under the age of 21 at the time. Check. Thomas Matthews, date of birth, 11/22/95, again 18 years of age. Anna, Natalie, both testified that he drank wine all night long. There's the picture to prove. Done. Person under the age of 21 possessed or consumed wine, Natalie Freeman. 12/20/1996. Natalie didn't appear as quite many photos, but you see her there at the table. And she got on this witness stand and she said, yes, Mr. Waller, I drank wine several times. I had at least 1 glass of wine in the front, and I had 1 glass of wine in the back. And then J.T. Taylor, 1/30/1996. 18 years of age. I believe Natalie, was 17 years of age at the time. JT was consuming the alcohol as well, the wine that night there at the party. Not only do we know from Natalie and Anna that he was drinking, well, you have his blood alcohol concentration, the 0.20 that you saw a while ago at the end of state's evidence. The fact that the wreck occurred. He was drunk that night. He was intoxicated. But what I want you to understand, ladies and gentlemen, is the burden that I have to meet in this case is not that they were drunk. It is just that they consumed alcohol. So some of you may be saying, well, hey, Mr. Waller, what about that Jack Daniels that they had before the party? Maybe that played a role into them getting drunk. And I'm sure it did. I'm sure passing around a bottle of Jack Daniels and finishing about 15 minutes caused some of this intoxication. But that's not, there's no element that says drunk, that the kids were drunk. Certainly they were. I mean, that's not in dispute here, ladies and gentlemen. They were drunk. But what we have to show is that they consumed the wine at the wedding. And those photographs and the testimony that you've heard here from the witness stand show that they possessed and consumed the wine at the wedding, in addition to the Jack Daniels. Defendants knew or had reason to know that the person was under the age of 21 at the time. And I skipped number 2, the knowingly aiding part, and I'll come back to that here in a moment. They're friends and classmates of Thomas Matthews. They grew up together or have known each other from 7th grade. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Matthews knew these kids. They'd been around them for a while. They knew that they were in school with their son. They knew how old they were. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment. But when it comes to talking about what the bartenders knew, or what the bartenders and the servers and the ABC store clerk knew, they didn't ask for identification. These folks knew that they were under 21. They had known them, and they knew that they were under 21 when they had them there at their house. They've known them, and they knew that they were under 21. Fourth element was defendant was over the age of 21 at the time. You heard from Officer Wall and Sergeant Hoolan that when he spoke with them, he got the date of birth over 21. Again, I know it seems like a simple element, but I have to present it, and you can check it off your list when you go back there. So let's get into the heart of this matter. When you walked in this courtroom on Monday morning, this is what this case was about. Aiding and encouraging the underage persons to consume or possess the wine. Aid, to provide what is useful or necessary in achieving an end. These kids went over there that night to get drunk. I'm not hiding it. I'm not fighting it. They went over there that night to get drunk. They helped them do it. Those two individuals helped them do it. They aided them in doing so. They didn't stop it from happening. They let it go on right under their noses. They provided what is useful or necessary in achieving an end. How did the defendants aid the teenagers? What have you heard from the witness stand? What exhibits have you seen that show that they helped them out? We'll start with the simple things. They provided the alcohol. And I know there's, the catering company has said, no, we did not bring the wine in. It was provided by the groom's family. At the end of the day, they put the wine out there. They put the alcohol out there on the table, readily available for the kids, for the teenagers. They were the ones that supplied it. You can call it technical terms of, well, Ridgewood Shopping Center Winery provided it. No. At the end of the day, it's the Matthews home, and they allowed for the wine to be there. It's a wedding. I understand that there's going to be wine at a lot of weddings. But when you bring that wine, when you bring that alcohol to the wedding, it adds some responsibility when you allow 18 and 17-year-old teenagers to be there. So in simple terms, they provided the alcohol. They provided the venue. They provided the party. We're going to a party. We're going to this area of the house where there's going to be wine available, and we're going to go to the back area of the house where there's wine available. They provided the venue for them to go and get drunk that night, intoxicated that night. But more important, and this is where you start having to use the circumstantial evidence and kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together. They provided the atmosphere. And this is where I want you to start thinking about what people said from this witness stand. People that aren't as involved. The teenagers, I know, they had an agenda to go over there and get drunk. What did the outside people say? What did the adults say? Lindsay Riggenbach, the teacher who'd known the kids, she was uncomfortable about the underage drinking at the residence. Joshua Weaver, the person that they hired, was in shock because of underage kids drinking. Sharon Beinecke, a nice teacher that had taught each one of these kids. They walked up, or I walked up to them in line. They had wine glasses in front of them. And I thought, this is awkward. Why does she think that's awkward, ladies and gentlemen? She thinks it's awkward because there's underage kids drinking wine or having wine right in front of her. And when she says, this is awkward, they respond, you can't do anything about it. You're not our kids. We're not your kids. Well, guess whose kids they were that night? They were their kids. They could put a stop to it, and they didn't. Dad Lawrence, the photographer, he's got a lot going on that night. He's all over the place taking pictures, but he noticed that the teenagers were intoxicated. Brian Johnson, the family friend, he noticed that JT was extremely intoxicated and he was concerned about him driving. Kenneth Walters, the EMS personnel, what was his say? Ladies and gentlemen, that's powerful testimony. I decided I needed to move Anna out of that basement because I didn't feel comfortable down there. There was something about the atmosphere that I just didn't feel comfortable where she was, so I moved her to the ambulance. Instead of leaving her there, he knew he needed to call her parents to get her out of that situation or either let her go with RPD. And then Officer Wall, they were nonchalant about the intoxicated nature of Anna. The atmosphere, one of acceptance, one of it's okay that this is going on over here. We're not putting a stop to it. The teenagers went to this house for a reason. They didn't know the bride. They didn't know the groom. They knew Thomas, but they didn't know the people getting married. They got a late afternoon invite, and they said, we can go have a good time. You heard from Anna that she told you she's got a fake ID, she had access to other liquor, but she decided to go to that house that night to get drunk, to have a good time. Ask yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, why would she have done that? If she was bent on getting drunk that night, why go there? She went there because she knew it'd be okay. She knew she wouldn't get in trouble with the parents. She knew it was going to be accepted. If you go over to Chick-fil-A, you expect to get a chicken sandwich and it'd be okay. She knew that going over to that house, it was going to be okay for her to drink wine and get drunk, and nobody was going to say anything to her. And not only does she have that feeling beforehand, and you can see it in the photographs. She's not hiding it in the least. In opening statements, I talked about responsibility. And that's how I started off this closing argument with as well. Responsibility. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. They didn't do anything to prevent these kids from drinking this way. And you may ask yourself, okay, why are we here? What are we doing here? This is an extreme case, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't a father and son sitting on their back porch the night before son or daughter goes off to college and says, hey, you want to share a Coors Light before you go off? This is extreme intoxication. This is someone dying. This is two ladies ending up in a basement unconscious and sick. This is not a father and son just hanging out, having one beer together. Is that against the law too? Yes. But is RPD going to swoop in with the SWAT team and break up the father-son on the back porch acting responsible? Probably not. But this is extreme. This is extreme because of what happened. Just the outright nature of it. And it's other people's kids. It's other people's kids. They allowed other people's kids to come to their home and they didn't take care of them. They let them be involved in this. And they didn't take responsibility for other people's kids. They weren't safe. They weren't responsible. It was out in the open. Mr. Miles used the terms of discreet and sly several times, talking, I believe, to Anna and Natalie. Ladies and gentlemen, there was nothing discreet about this. I mean, there's glasses all over the table. They're walking around with the wine glasses, as we'll see in some photos in a moment, or have seen. There is nothing discreet about this whatsoever. Did they walk up? Is there a photograph of them walking up and giving the Matthews a big hug with a wine glass in their hand? No, but you've seen it. You've seen it over and over. They are doing absolutely nothing to hide this. I want to talk about responsibility. They never took their keys from them. They never said, hey, you are extremely drunk. I'm going to call your parents in regards to Anna and JT. Natalie was taking it upon herself to call her parents, and Mrs. Matthews assisted. But especially regarding Anna and JT, Anna is unconscious in the basement, and it takes the EMS worker to say, hey, we need to call somebody. The Matthews never did that. They never took responsibility for those kids or acknowledged responsibility to the other parents. They didn't do anything to stop it at all. And their defense, as I assume is going to, I didn't see it. I turned a blind eye to it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's not acceptable. Turning a blind eye to this is not a defense. So I anticipate that Mr. Miles is going to talk to you about knowingly aid and abet these kids and how they did or did not know about what was going on. Well, let's look at the photographs and we'll walk through them. You've seen this front patio area. You see all the kids there hanging out, having a good time. I guess in this photograph there is a water bottle, but you've seen the other photographs where wine and champagne is clearly in front of them. And who do you see tucked away here in the background? I know it's hard to see in this photograph, but Dr. Matthews. If you listen to Mr. Weaver and the bartenders, they told you that the way you got to this bar, the area in which Dr. Matthews is you had to go right through here. You had to walk right past this table where they are. There he is. Had to walk right past. Did they know? We've seen this back picture a lot. This is where the kids are, over on this table. And there you see Dr. Matthews taking a seat beside his daughter, Alex, who's been identified as Alex. And Thad, look, the photographer, Mr. Lawrence, when he was asked how far away was this seat from that table, he said 5 feet. That's less of a distance than between here and that witness stand. When you're all sitting on that witness stand, you can see the jury, you can see the deputies, you can see the defense table, you can see me. You can't tell me, ladies and gentlemen, that when he's sitting right there 5 feet away from them with wine glasses on the table, he doesn't know what's going on. Did they know? The bride literally walked down the aisle beside JT with a wine glass in his hand. I'm not saying that they had to take the time to stop the wedding. Nicole, stop where you are. We got to go take those wine glasses out of their hands. Let her get down the aisle, let her get on the dance floor, and walk over there and say, hey, guys, chill out. You can't be doing this in our house. But nope, the bride walks right past them on her way to the first dance. And I know, sure, everybody's looking at Nicole. But if you're looking at Nicole, you're looking at JT. First dance. Anna Ergish drinking her wine in the background. You see Miss Beneke in this photograph. She said she noticed him, even during the first dance. And she's friends with Nicole. She's there for Nicole. And she notices him. The dance ends, hey guys, chill out. Let's not drink anymore. Let me take that from you. No, it never happened. Did they know? Cake cutting, Mrs. Beinecke, excuse me, Dr. Matthews, and JT directly behind her. At that point in the night, JT is impaired. Both the photographer and Lucia Foster testified at this point in the night, he's drunk, standing right behind Dr. Matthews. Their own son, Thomas, is walking around with a wine glass impaired. If he's drunk, ladies and gentlemen, what should that tell them? Hey, I should probably go check on his other buddies that he brought with me. He's drunk, walking around with a wine glass. Everybody, there was some talk about, no, they just stayed over at the table. That was their home base. They never left from that table all night long. There he is, middle of the dance floor. Did they know? JT, right before he leaves, walking onto the dance floor with a glass of wine, with champagne. Open, out in front of everybody. And not once did they walk over to him and say, put it down, put it away. And they didn't do it because it was accepted, because they were encouraging it. They weren't stopping it. Testimony that you heard showing did they know. Officer Wall, we had a wedding here. He was intoxicated, coming from Dr. Matthews. Again, Officer Wall from Dr. Matthews. She has been drinking. She came to the wedding with JT. She was very gone when I came down here, and I felt as though I needed to call for EMS. They told Kenneth Walters she has been drinking. The last thing you heard here in court today, the 911 call, I know she has had alcohol. Mrs. Matthews takes care of Natalie. Mrs. Matthews takes JT in the room off the kitchen. Mrs. Matthews doesn't acknowledge anyone else being in the house to Officer Wall. Consciousness of guilt, ladies and gentlemen. We've got some drunk kids, and we've had some drunk kids in this house, and we've got one in there now. I don't want this police officer to find out about that. So I'm going to tell him no one else is in the house. But then I'm going to walk downstairs with my husband and realize that she is unconscious, and oh no, we better do something. She knew what was happening. This is not a wedding at Duke Chapel with 500 people there. It's in their own backyard with an estimate of maybe 50 people there. Everybody's walking around talking to everybody. Everybody else noticed that these kids were drunk. Everybody you've heard from that witness stand said these kids were drunk. Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Matthews both see JT after he's drunk. Mrs. Matthews, when she takes him into the library right before the Brian Johnson incident, and then you heard Miss Foster, Lucia Foster, the bartender, say that she saw Dr. Matthews and JT having a conversation. And what is important about what she saw during that conversation? That was after she had already given him the bottles of water because he was impaired. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard that he is a doctor. If he can't recognize that that young man is so impaired that he is a .20, what is he looking at? He is a doctor. He should know that that young man is impaired. And they have a conversation after the bartender says that he's impaired, and he still doesn't do anything. He doesn't get on the phone to Greg Taylor and say, hey, your son is impaired. He doesn't take JT's keys. He doesn't do anything with him. How could they not have known? They didn't do anything that was happening in front of them. Ladies and gentlemen, one thing Judge Smith is going to tell you is you are to apply reason and common sense in applying the law in this case. We do not ask you to check that at the door when you walk in. Think about your own life experiences. You can bring them to the table in terms of just how do I know something is amiss here? How do I know that something is not right? You've seen all those photographs and you've heard all the testimony. How did they not know? Ask yourself that. I understand they're busy. Everybody's busy at the wedding, excuse me. But even the other busy people at the wedding, Joshua Weaver, who's probably doing 15 different things to keep everybody happy, says that person is drunk. Mr. Lawrence has taken over 2,600 pictures, and he says that person is drunk. Dr. Matthews was talking to his other daughter a lot during the night. Do you not think he went up to Thomas sometimes during the night as well and said, hey, you're drunk. Stop. It defies reason and common sense to say that they didn't know what was happening. And that's what you're to apply in this case. Reason and common sense. We talked about it in jury selection over and over about following the law. Again, and I mentioned it in opening statements, and I want to reiterate it here. They're not charged with killing JT. Okay, we talked about his death. It's part of this puzzle. It shows how intoxicated he was, but they're not charged with that. Okay, they're charged with misdemeanor, aid and abet, consumption of alcohol. That's it. And when you look at those elements, there's 4 simple elements. That's what they did. They didn't kill him. I know they didn't kill him. I'm not asking you to say they killed him. But they assisted, they aided, they encouraged, they allowed these kids to drink at that party that night, wedding that night. That's what you're here to decide. Target of investigation. That was a term used in opening statements and some of the questions to Officer Manukas and Sergeant Houlihan. Well, they were the people that you went after right to start with. Ladies and gentlemen, you may think, that the bartenders have some responsibility here. You may think that, some of the other adults there that didn't say anything, that they have some responsibility. You may think that, they're the ABC's clerk, that he should have more responsibility. That's fine. It's not wrong of you to think that. That is your opinion. And those people have been or will be dealt with in their own time frame. But you're here to decide about these people today. Okay? Just because you think, hey, Lucia Foster, she should have been written a citation, doesn't excuse what they did. And that's a very important difference, or a very important thing. Just because one person doesn't have any consequences doesn't mean that they should get off. The buck stopped with them, ladies and gentlemen. That's where it stopped. That was the last line of defense. It was their house. It was their wedding. It was their alcohol. Sure, could other people done something different as well? Yes. But as Ms. Beinecke said, I didn't know that the social or legal responsibilities that I had. In other words, she was saying it wasn't her place. Figuratively and literally, it wasn't her place. It was their place. They were allowing it to go on. So don't give them a pass just because you're mad that somebody else isn't here. That's not what you're here to do, is pick and choose who is charged. You're here to decide whether they are the people responsible, or at least partly responsible. There's different levels of responsibility, and ladies and gentlemen, I'd argue to you that they are the most responsible because it was their party. It was their house. And then the part about they were a target of investigation from early on, and there was a rush to judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, there was over a month went by before they were charged. And you've heard what Sergeant Houlihan and Officer Manukas did during that time. They interviewed people. They gathered evidence. And only after they gathered all that evidence and interviewed all those people, that's when they were charged. So there was no rush to judgment here. There was no, these are the people we're going to charge and we're going to do it right away. No. They went through a process. And finally, selfish, inconsiderate, and reckless. Those were the three words that we heard from Mr. Miles in the opening statement about the teenagers. And he's wrong. Absolutely, those four teenagers were selfish, they were inconsiderate, and they were reckless on the night of June 28, 2014. But they were also 18 and 17 years old, not over 50 years old. They were selfish in getting drunk at this party. They were inconsiderate to Nicole and essentially crashing her wedding. I feel bad for Nicole. I feel worse for Trooper Taylor and Mrs. Taylor for losing their son, but yeah, her night's ruined, and that was inconsiderate of them. And it was reckless for JT to get in that car. But let's turn it around. Let's look at who the adults were in this situation. They were selfish in not stopping the party, in not stopping the wedding, or at least not stopping what they were doing in the wedding, and walking over to him and saying, "Give me those wine glasses." That's selfish. They were having too much fun. They weren't taking care of their responsibilities. Inconsiderate. Natalie Freeman's parents trusted that their child was going to be safe over there. The Taylors trusted that their child was going to be safe over there. The Ergish family, they trusted that their child was going to be safe over there. That, ladies and gentlemen, is inconsiderate. Not taking care of other people's children in your home. Children, teenagers, whatever label you want to give them. Young people. Not taking care of other people's children. And reckless. Allowing this to go on, not stopping. Not taking keys, not calling parents, not walking over and saying, "Give me the wine glasses." That's reckless as well. Selfish, inconsiderate, and reckless goes both ways, ladies and gentlemen. And when you're the adult in the situation, you lose. How did we get here? How did we get in this courtroom? We got in this courtroom by them acting that way. By them allowing this to happen. By them allowing those kids to drink that wine that night. Aid and abet underage consumption and possession of alcohol. That's what you're here to decide. You've heard from the witness stand, the evidence to support it, and I think that what Judge Smith will instruct you on the law will mesh together. And based on that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you find both Dr. Matthews and Mrs. Matthews guilty on all four charges. I thank you for your time, I thank you for your attention, and I thank you for doing your civic duty.
Sir, we'll take recess now before the next argument. We'll take a recess until 2 o'clock. Please remember and follow my instructions. Jurors are excused. Everyone else remain in place. Everyone else remain in place. I repeat for the third time now. Everyone else remain in place. We're in the absence of the jury. Have you had a chance now to look over the proposed written instructions?
Yes, sir.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
You were arguing, so I don't know that you have. But I want the clerk to be able to make some copies so they'll be ready after your argument, but we can do that later. Take a recess till 2 o'clock.
Superior Court stands in recess until 2 o'clock.